Welcome everyone to the inaugural session of the AIJA Women Network. This has been an initiative that has been planned for the last 12 months with various conversations ongoing with various people in our organisation. It was quite clear that 12 months ago, sitting in the sunshine in Rome, a group of us agreed on the fact that AIJA is a super inclusive association and that men and women are supported and their success celebrated. But it was also time to create a more formal place where women could discuss the challenges and opportunities that they face throughout their career in the legal profession. And I think the AIJA Women Network is one aspect of AIJA's ongoing commitment to diversity and inclusion, which will continue beyond this virtual Congress in which we are all currently participating. So today is the start of this initiative, and it's for our members, run by our members, and everybody is warmly welcome to participate. It's going to become a part of our association's fabric for years to come. And you are all very welcome here today. I'm now delighted to hand over to Jennifer Maxwell, who is one of the brains behind this initiative, to give you a little bit more background as to why we've been inspired to launch this network. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks very much, Paula, and thanks to everyone who's speaking today and everyone who's attending today. So about 1 year ago at the annual Congress in Rome, as Paula mentioned, there was a group of us who sat together in the sun and we wanted to catch up. And then we also started talking about the recently announced theme of diversity for the upcoming Rio Congress. We started brainstorming about possible sessions for Rio, and then our plans grew bigger. And that's because there is no doubt that female representation within the legal sector is not what it should be. So if you bear with me, I just want to share a few statistics. McKinsey report on women in US law firms found that women are relatively well represented at the associate level at 46%. But once you get up to the equity partner level, that drops to 19%. That same report also found that women of color are even more badly represented, accounting for only 10% of senior associates and only 3% of equity partners. If you move outside of private practice and look at what's happening in companies, there are also issues. For example, only 26% of general counsel of Fortune 500 companies are women. Then I'm based here in London, and if I look closer to home, in Germany, there's a good example. In Germany, over 50% of first-year associates are women, but on the equity partner level, only 16% are women. So those numbers aren't great. But then we started talking about AIJA, and as Paula mentioned, there's a lot of positive development there. For example, the leadership positions in AIJA are split about 50-50 between men and women. And then a lot of us have partnered with AIJA Women members on client files, and we were really impressed by their knowledge, dedication, and professionalism. So we started thinking about how we could use these positive green shoots and build it into something more that can help women's careers and perhaps the legal sector as a whole. That's how we created the AIJA Women's Network. We have 3 long-term goals. One is to create a peer support network where women can discuss the unique issues that they face. Number 2 is to build the women's careers by strengthening networking and referral relationships. And 3, which is as important as 1 or 2, is to engage with everyone, regardless of gender, regardless of anything, to work together to try to create a more inclusive sector. So I'm so pleased that we're kicking off our network today with this important session on unconscious bias. But I wanted to let you all know that we're not stopping there. We have lots of plans for the upcoming year. For example, we've already planned sessions on how to engage men with gender diversity issues, how to develop new business, how to address strategies for the barriers to partnership, and that's just the start. So I hope that you will join us for all of those future sessions as you have done here today. Finally, one last point. Our network is very inclusive, so if you're interested in getting involved on an organizational or leadership level, you would be very welcome. All you need to do is get in touch with either myself or Paola, and we'll introduce you to the rest of the crew. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderators. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer and Paola, for the great introduction. Francesca and I are excited to be the organizers and moderators for today's session, Identifying and Counteracting Bias. So just a brief introduction of us. I'm KATJA GARVEY, a privacy and M&A attorney from KEGLER Brown, located in Columbus, Ohio. I'm a German native and also graduated from law school in Germany before moving to the US. And I've been an AIJA member since 2013.
I'm Francesca della VOLTA. I'm Italian, and after studying law in Italy, Ireland, and London, I now work in a US law firm, RUDNICK, in the London office. I've been a member of AIJA since 2016. Just before we move on to introduce today's speakers, while everyone in the audience should automatically be muted, please double check your settings and mute yourself if necessary. If you wish to ask questions to the speakers, that's possible. By all means, do so. You can do it through the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of the screen. You can type your questions in the Q&A function anytime during the session or later during the Q&A session. Kat and I will monitor all questions and will address this to the speakers during the Q&A session or at the appropriate time during the session. Please do not use the chat function because it has been disabled for the public, and so we might miss your questions if you do so. Last but not least, just a reminder that all Congress sessions will be recorded and shared onto the virtual Congress platform. So if you know about any members who haven't been able to attend this session, they will be able to watch the recording of it from tomorrow.
Great, let's move into the program and welcome our panelists, Charlotte PERQUIN and CLARKE. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please briefly introduce yourself and your experience and work before we move into the panel discussion.
Shall I go first? Thank you, Katja. I'm so glad to be here and I'm really looking forward to this session. My name is Charlotte PERQUIN-DEELEN. I'm a corporate lawyer at DIRKZWAGER in the Netherlands. And as a lawyer, my main focus is corporate governance in the healthcare industry. Recently, I obtained my PhD at the Radboud University in the Netherlands on the topic biases in the boardroom and the courtroom. Which is a legal and philosophical research based on my two backgrounds. So I think that's the reason why I'm here today to talk about biases and how they affect us.
Thanks, everyone. My name is RENAULD Clark. I am the Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity at Brown RUDNICK, where FRANCESCA practices. I'm based in New York, in fact, in Harlem, New York, if you're familiar with New York at all. And I am a former practicing attorney. I graduated from Vanderbilt University Law School in Nashville, Tennessee, before coming back to New York, where I'm originally from, to practice law. And after some time practicing, I decided to shift my career and became a consultant doing diversity and inclusion. After consulting for a few years for a small consultancy based in Brooklyn, New York, I decided to join Paul Weiss, another law firm in New York, and was a part of their inclusion group there for several years prior to coming to Brown RUDNICK. I am so glad to have been invited to participate in this conversation, and I look forward to all of what we are going to discuss today.
Thank you, guys. So let's get started. Charlotte, can you please talk about bias more generally to get everyone on the same page? Like, why are we even talking about bias?
Yeah, first of all, let's define biases. Biases are undesirable or desirable systematic influences in our judgment and our decision making, and they arise from the human mind. And the human mind consists of the conscious and the unconscious part, simply stated. And these biases are not always recognized as such because we are not aware of these influences. And that is why it is so important that today we talk about biases, to name the feature and to see what they do. Because everyone has biases, because everyone has an unconscious, even though you don't really realize it all of the time. And even though we can be aware of the existence of biases, this does not simply mean that by knowing we have biases, that biases just don't influence you. Biases influence everyone, men and women. And we find it very important to state that this is not, we're not blaming anyone that you are influenced by biases. I did a research of 5 years into biases, and still I am influenced by my biases. And also everyone has gender-oriented biases. Today we talk about biases from a quite negative perspective. However, it is important to realize that biases also have a positive impact. Biases are more broad, are unconscious, allows us to make fast judgment. Our unconscious is that part of the brain that has a larger reaction speed than our conscious. For example, we are able to drive a car, well, for a large part because of our unconscious, pushing the pedal, looking in our mirrors, shifting gears, talking to the person in the car. It is mainly possible because of the reaction speed of our unconscious. So we need our unconscious and we kind of need our biases. However, they can lead to prejudgment and to inequality. And that is the issue we are facing today. And the issue we would like to talk with everyone about. How can we address the biases in our workplace and what can we do about it? Because we are not to blame that we have biases, but we can all actively decide what we do about our biases and how we allow the biases to affect our behavior. So yeah. Oh, Francesca, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought to click on it. I'm muted now. So I was saying, thanks, Charlotte. Can you please give us an overview of all the different types of bias that women often face? We have referenced some of them in the session description, but it would be very helpful to understand the meaning of each of these bias. Feel free to include examples.
Sure. So, you know, I also want to be able to piggyback on something that Charlotte said, in that these are biases are things that really do benefit us in the way that we live our lives in many ways. We all have them and we're not bad people for having them. But often these biases that we have, they're learned behaviors. These behaviors are sometimes learned based on the experiences that we may have with other people, or in life more generally, but they are also based on stereotypes that we might learn from other people, that may or may not be true about the identified class of people or group of others. So it's important to recognize that while these are unconscious biases and they're cognitive shortcuts that we may take in order for us to live our lives every single day, it's important to understand ways for us to interrupt these biases so that we can more accurately engage with other people, not based on the stereotypes or learned behaviors that we have, but based on actual factual engagement with other people. And also recognizing that these shortcuts, how they allow us to or prompt us to discriminate either positively or negatively for or against other people, well. We must be aware of that as well, so that we can allow everyone to be more, and allow ourselves to be more inclusive in our behaviors, right? So in terms of stereotypes and how they interact and how we actually are based on them, stereotypes, as I said, can be positive or negative. And so one of the biases that I'd like to talk about is based on the stereotypes that we see about leadership. Right? So if you would indulge me for a moment in a brief thought experiment, close your eyes and in a moment, imagine a CEO or managing partner of a law firm. What does that person look like? So in that snapshot, you had an image of a leader in your mind. More often than not, the stereotypes that we have about leaders tend to be that they are male and of a certain age, perhaps 45 or older. And they often tend to be Caucasian or white. That's a stereotype that we all have about leaders, that we've learned by experience, having seen that many or most of the leaders of Fortune 500 companies and law firms happen to be white male leaders. But so that actually is how that stereotype will influence and create a bias in all of us in terms of what we think about leadership, who might be the appropriate leaders that we look to. So actually, I should note that, you know, since 1990, for instance, women have represented over 60% of entrants into the profession. But as of 2017 and continuing to this day, the majority of practicing lawyers are partners. The majority of partners, rather, in practicing law firms are 28% women, rather. So women only encompass 28% of partners at law firms, and yet they are over 50% of the entrants into the profession. Managing partners and leaders of Fortune 500 companies and of law firms also overwhelmingly are men. So it's interesting to see how that bias and those stereotypes affect the ways in which we interact with each other and the ways that we are promoted and advanced through our organizations into leadership. So that's leadership bias. Another bias is performance bias. In brief, it is our assumption that some classes of people are perceived as better or at certain tasks than others based on the stereotypes that we've learned. So, for instance, seeing women as less capable and therefore evaluating them from a deficit. Another example is confirmation bias, for instance. So having a stereotype about a certain group and finding evidence in our experiences with them to confirm that stereotype that we have. And so therefore, interacting with others or members of that group based on what we now think is confirmed evidence of behavior. So those are just a few of the examples: leadership bias, performance bias, and confirmation bias. But I'll pass it to Charlotte to discuss a few more.
Thank you, Renaud. First of all, we're not discussing all types of biases. We've chosen biases that we think are present in the workspace most vivid. The bias I want to discuss is maternal bias. When women are in the age group of about 25 to 40, when they are hired, they are kind of implicitly expected to get pregnant soon. Other signal red flags are they are getting married, people are actually counting, oh wow, aren't you pregnant yet? Or when you start living together with someone else. And this implicit attitude leads to the implicit assumption that these women have less ambition, they have less time, they work less hard because, well, I don't know, because they're busy with thinking about children or something. But it tells us something about how these women are valued, even though they might not even want to have children. They're not thinking about it. But also when they got one child, everyone expects them to get pregnant again. So the whole biases around the possibility of maternity really affects the hiring process, but also the evaluation process during your once you're hired, and also affect your opportunity and your possibilities to grow to a different function or to grow up, because they will think implicitly, oh, you will get pregnant, so then you won't be present all the time, or etc., etc. The other bias we would like to discuss is the likability bias. Women and women leaders are often characterized as negative when they show behavior we do not really expect from them. For example, when they are really strict, they are not nice. Or when they are really assertive, they are too assertive. When women are proud of their performances or their achievements, they are arrogant. If women get mad, then you're too emotional. Women are only expected, implicitly, but also explicitly sometimes, to be likable, to be nice, to be friendly, just smile and wave. Even if you're a professional businesswoman and you do not always want to smile and wave. In the Netherlands, we had an example of recently of the mayor of our capital city of Amsterdam. And she was described in the newspapers just before she began as a mayor as a cold ice princess. That is not to be said about a male mayor who did not even start their job yet as a cold ice king or something. Those are not typical criteria or words that are linked to male, but they are linked to female in a negative way. The last bias we would like to discuss is the affinity bias. And the affinity bias is like the similarity bias. We choose and we often like people that are similar to us. And one of the reasons is that we recognize qualities in other people when we possess them as well, or we think we possess them as well. Qualities we don't have are harder to see and harder to recognize the value of those qualities in other people if we don't have them. So this is, you can see what the effect is if you are in a selection committee to select candidates for the board, or even if in your surroundings when you want to hire a new lawyer, you recognize the qualities you have yourself. So that really that's not diverse. Then you create a homogeneous people. And also, to come back to gender, if the male are at the top, which we just talked about, that a lot of the law firms have males on top, they select the other candidates. So male choose male, to state it well bluntly. And this is also part of the halo effect. And the halo effect is about, we think that nice people also have a nice character. So if someone does something nice, then you think, oh, that must be a nice person, and in all of your business, in your private life, etc., etc. So if we combine that with the likability bias, as women do something, we're like, oh, what is she doing? She's arrogant. Combined with the halo effect, then women are less able to climb up than males because of those biases. So yeah, I think that is, in short, the biases.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlotte. And you know, it's something that you said, Charlotte, already, is that, you know, there are so many different types of biases and they affect our interactions with others in so many very different ways. But something that we should also recognize is that we are all complex human beings, right? So we all have very different, many layers to our identities. We aren't just one thing. And that includes everyone across the spectrum of diversity, men, women, and all of the different categories of diversity in terms of who we are. And so we have to recognize that because of there are different layers or levels of our characteristics, they often interact and intersect with one another. And so one of the things that I'd like to also highlight is that the experiences that you may have based on one type of bias, i.e. likability bias or maternity bias, that would also be compounded with the experiences you may have based on other biases. And that is that actually goes to a concept called intersectionality, or what some people have called double discrimination, right? So having the effect of more than one bias or more than one discriminatory effect based on top of another. So intersectionality is a theory that was developed in the late 1980s by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. Now, she is an American lawyer, professor, and civil rights advocate. And her theory describes how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. And therefore, this overlapping creates an experience unique to that individual, but that contains all of the other different effects that they may have attendant to those individual characteristics. So it describes the disadvantages that are experienced by people due to multiple sources of oppression based on those overlapping characteristics. So, so just note that those of us who have multiple characteristics that would be considered diverse, or who identify with more than one category of diversity, experience the effects of both of these or all of these overlapping characteristics at the same time, compounding the difficulties they may encounter in the workplace. So for instance, a woman in the workplace who is experiencing maternity bias because she may have just, for instance, returned from parental leave, and so the assumption is that she may not be as available or as focused on either her career or her work. That experience from maternity bias may also be overlapping with her experience perhaps as a person of color, as a Black woman in the workplace. So not only is she experiencing the bias or the effects of bias attendant to her as a woman, but also to her as a person of color, as a Black person. So all of the assumptions that some in the workplace might have about her abilities as a person of color are compounded by the assumptions that they are making about her now as a woman who is married and with children. And so that is an experience that we should also highlight, and we can talk about that a little bit more later on, but I just wanted to make sure to talk about that in this moment as well.
Thanks, RENAULD. And where does bias come up the most? For example, hiring, allocation of assignments, opportunity to do business, evaluation, promotion, compensation, access to mentorship and support. Can you just talk about it a bit more, and feel free to make examples?
Well, I can jump in on that. You know, sorry, were you going to say something? Okay, so I can jump in on that. So I would say that there are many different entry points during the entire, let's say, talent management life cycle in which unconscious biases or biases from an organizational perspective might enter into those processes. So it's anywhere from hiring all the way through to promotion and advancement throughout the organization. So you may experience hiring bias in hiring in the ways, for instance, you might evaluate the characteristics of an applicant to an organization, for instance. So when we receive resumes, we look at a resume, and based on what we see, we might assume certain things about this person. So for instance, if you look even at the name of a candidate, or you're looking at their school, so if I might have gone to, as I said, I went to Vanderbilt University Law School. Based on the resume, if I receive one from someone who also went to Vanderbilt University, I'll have affinity for that person just based on that. That bias will make me review that person more positively than I might other candidates. If I recognize that they're part of the same organization, a fraternal organization, for instance, I might be more willing, based on affinity bias, to bring them in to my organization than I might others. So that's an example of how it might come into hiring. into work allocation as you're an associate, for instance, working in a law firm. I might be more willing to provide work or delegate work to a more junior attorney with whom I identify in some way, shape, form, or fashion, or I might find them, for instance, more likable. Based on characteristics that I've seen, or based on my stereotypes. I might find them more likable, and because I'm more willing to work with them because I like them, I might give them more work. Well, of course, that affects the ways in which we are able to develop, because we aren't getting the right type of assignments, we aren't getting opportunities to grow, and so therefore we're not advancing and being reviewed in the way that we should, or given the opportunities that are equal to those of our peers, for instance. So in terms of promotion, you know, likability is another way in which, or another bias, I should say, that affects the ways that people are promoted. So not only are you evaluated based on certain biases, but you are promoted based on biases as to whether you have been likable, whether people perceive you as being dedicated or not, based on stereotypes, and then getting to a position of leadership within an organization. If you aren't liked, or if you aren't perceived as capable based on the stereotypes about you, you might not be given opportunities to lead in your organization. And so those are many of the ways in which bias might affect your experiences as a diverse person in the workplace, as a woman in the workplace, and we see examples of that time and time again.
Yeah, I think if I can add something, Renaud, I think biases lead to kind of a biased perspective on qualities in general. And it begins with hiring, of course, and when you receive resumes, etc., etc. And we can also talk about how to deal with that and how to attack those biases, but I think we will come to that a little bit later. But also think about the work of headhunters. So you are not actively sending in your resume, but the way headhunters work, they also see qualifications and qualities through, most of the time, a gendered biased vision. So even with the opportunities headhunters give you, which are often really big opportunities, they are a lot of times given to male because they are just being seen, they are being recognized, they are being like in the Netherlands we call it a pond. I don't know if that's like a pond with a lot of fish. I don't know if that's in English also a correct use of words, but they don't see the fish, they don't see the women fish, kind of, and even combined with the intersectionality you just described, it's even worse for example, women who are black, etc., etc., to add all the different biases. So even before that, even before you decide you want something else and you decide to send your resume, you even get less chances as well, just before that. Yeah.
So we've already received a question about this. I know this is very relevant to our attendees and to me personally, honestly. What are some strategies or recommendations that one can follow to reduce the impact of bias, both on a personal or individual level, but also from an organizational level?
Sure, I can start with that question, and it's a fantastic one. In my work as Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity at Brown-RUDNICK, that's my job, is to try to create strategies and implement strategies to diminish the effects of bias in our processes as an organization, and create a culture at the firm that allows us to be more inclusive and equitable in the ways in which we distribute work, the way that we interact with one another, and the way that we see one another. And so to truly counteract the effects of bias in the workplace setting, there has to be a shift in the culture of the organization. And that's something that everyone has to be an active participant in. You can't create change in an organization without everyone truly being bought in, so to speak, and without everyone from the top down, from leadership throughout the organization, really doing their part to affect this kind of culture change within your organization. Understand that you know, just like society has a culture, organizations have culture. And I think Charlotte can probably speak to that a bit as well, but through her work and her scholarship. But you know, we recognize that organizations have cultures, and so we have to be able, in order to shift the culture, to take certain steps. And so some of those steps, from my view, include what I would do as a consultant, which is an organizational culture assessment. So that means you're assessing the talent management processes of an organization, from, as we've been talking about, hiring all the way through promotion and development, all the way to advancement to leadership. Discovering where in your culture and where in these processes bias has or can creep in, and changing how the organization functions to counteract the effects of bias or remove its influence with an end toward being more inclusive. Okay, so with regard to hiring practices, so for instance, you would move away from traditional notions of what people call organizational fit, which is a tendency toward competency. We move from organizational fit and evaluating people based on what we believe about that person as to whether they would fit into our organization. Moving from that to more competency-based evaluation of a candidate's ability to contribute to the organization's overall mission. So for instance, blind recruitment processes that de-emphasize the characteristics that would feed into unconscious biases. We would try to make sure that there's gender balance among the participants who participate in the recruitment processes. So not just gender balance, but balance more generally, to make sure that there's a diverse group of people who are evaluating new hires or potential new hires to our organization. Another way is onboarding. When new employees join our organization, are they receiving the message, as I said, from the top down, that discrimination within your organization will not be tolerated, and that you as an organization are engaged in efforts to eliminate bias within its culture? That message must be conveyed throughout the organization to new hires especially. You have to try to dispel the notion that women or other underrepresented groups must become like men or like the majority groups in leadership to be successful in your organization. So that means you have to change the paradigm for success within your firm or within your company. With regard to work allocation, you have to interrupt informal work assignment processes, right? Where a partner may bring in a new file, and because of who they may just assign work to that individual, but they are the one, that's the favored son, so to speak, within your practice group, for instance. Move from that kind of informal work delegation process to something that is more unbiased and something that is more formal, that allows opportunities to be delegated more equitably within the group. There are several other ways, including as well bringing it from the processes of talent management to culture change. You can do anti-bias or de-biasing training, which is something that's very popular, and it has been for over a decade. In this current world in which we live, bias training or de-biasing training has even become even more popular, because more of us are awakening to the experiences of those who are different than us. But unconscious bias training, in order for it to be successful or meaningful, must be in many ways mandatory, or at least widely supported and attended by the leaders of an organization. Once again, that's about messaging. You have to send the message that this kind of training is important, and that it is a priority in order for it to actually mean something. And lastly, the last thing I would talk about is allyship. As I said, every one of us has to do our part. And in order, for instance, for women to be more accepted and to receive equal treatment and equal opportunities within our organizations, men must be part of that conversation as well. men must be allies, gender allies for women in order to truly create an inclusive and equitable space where both genders, or all genders, I should say, where all genders are treated equitably and evaluated equitably, and everyone feels like they can bring their best selves to work. Charlotte?
Yep, thank you. I think that gender allyship is beautiful and such a good instrument because, well, I'm not at the top of my organization, not at all. So if I want a conversation with the leader of my company about diversity, and I state, hey, all the things you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and he says, well, we're going to do that, but nothing happens. Okay, what to do then? Then you can use the gender ally system and look for your own allies and try to talk with other people about it and talk to your peers that are closer to you than the boss at the top level. But also, if you educate yourself and if you yourself get aware of biases and how they work, you can also help yourself and therefore help the other women in your organization. For example, now you know that biases can lead to unjust qualifications or evaluations. You can be alert and kind of assertive as to question, okay, but why do you think I'm not available? Or why do you think I don't get enough work done? Or so really get the conversation going, of course, in a respectful manner. I mean, we're in a workplace, but if you know the facts, then you can address it in a really respectful way to the people around you. And I think you can also be your own leader. Even if you are not a leader at your company, you are your own leader. So you can take, I think, you can take your own measures. For example, with the gender pay gap. I think in the Netherlands and also in other countries as well, there are companies, a lot of the times founded by women, that can really help you with your, I don't know the right word, to discuss your salary and to get the right salary. They can show you what is the scale, what do other people earn, and what are the tactics to get more money. And this is not all about getting more money, but just to close the gender pay gap. You can also help yourself, and you do not only depend on the bigger system. Of course, if the bigger system supports you, that is really important, but we cannot wait for that. And I think a lot of companies are really starting to deal with the topic of diversity. A lot of companies are also starting with diversity and inclusion, because that's really the next step, which is probably even more important, because otherwise you remain the outsider of the organization. But you can also do things yourself. I think read about it and educate yourself. Yeah. I think
actually, Charlotte, if I can jump back in, I think something that you just said really resonated with me for sure, because you can have a diverse organization. You can invite all manner of people, all kinds of people into your organization, but if they do not feel like they are included, or if they do not feel like they belong, if they're not brought to the table, there's a metaphor, so that you might invite me to the party, but you don't invite me to dance. So that someone may be in the room, but they're actually not included and actually not doing, they're not part of the mechanism of the organization, then for one, they won't last. They won't stay there for very long, and their experiences will be wholly negative because they haven't been given they haven't been seen in order to be given the opportunities to truly contribute to the organization. And the work that you're talking about, that we all need to do individually, is so very important. Those of us who have privilege, who acknowledge that we are privileged in certain ways, it is up to us to continue to learn how to change the way that we experience the workplace so that other people can belong in the way that we do, and to educate our peers as well, so that that we can collectively create a space where everyone is included. And so I thought that was a great point and really, really important for everyone to take away from this conversation today.
Thank you both. So it's 10 minutes to the end. We suggested to move to the Q&A sessions now. We have received already a number of questions in the Q&A function, so we will start to address those. But of course, we encourage anyone to continue to type in questions in case they wish to do so. And then we will try to answer to all by the end. We will follow up later. So Katja, would you like to take the first question?
Sure, I'll read the first one. So I sometimes ghostwrite for more senior female lawyers in my team. For example, letters that I've written but which go out in their name. I have more than one example where the recipient has responded in a subtle way that demonstrates bias. For example, your response was hysterical, not I'm sure in the funny sense. Any comments about that?
I think that resonates with the leadership bias and authority bias and well, a lot of biases. That are you being taken seriously? And how is your work valued? I think this is an example of a lot of the biases we discussed. And then probably the next question is, well, what can you do about it? I mean, you are confronted with it. You see that it is not correct. That is not the way we deal with each other, especially in a professional setting. And I think talking about it with your peer on how this affects you and how you can deal with that also towards the client. I don't know. I think the client was involved here as well. I think that is the starting point. But you need to have support, because otherwise, yeah, who are you talking to? But Renaud probably knows that as well, because your firm, yeah.
Absolutely. Not only throughout our careers, we experience stuff like this. I experienced it, and I have counterparts who experienced it in practice and to this day. The one thing that you have to do is cultivate a method for addressing this for yourself and for others. You have to find a way, that works for you. And it requires, although it may be exhausting, it requires a certain courage to be able to bring attention to what you're experiencing. And so in that, I encourage you to find the strength to be able to address it when you're experiencing these things. So for instance, some people use humor. Some people decide to make a joke out of it. In order to highlight that there is an issue, and then perhaps after the fact address it one-on-one with the person if something like this happened in a group setting. I've found that bringing things to the attention of people who you recognize are open and who don't have ill will, who don't mean you harm, but happen to be harming you in this instance. Bringing those things to their attention when you know that they are receptive can be very, very fruitful. So, what I have found in my own experience is, that there was times in practice, especially where I felt like I was being treated differently or negatively based upon who I am. When it's in a group setting, you don't want to embarrass a person. No one wants to be called a chauvinist in front of their peers, or embarrassed in some other way by calling them biased in some way. So what you might do is, after the fact, find an opportunity to have a conversation one-on-one with that person and say, hey, I just want to bring it back to your attention. You said X, Y, and Z, and that affected me in this way, and I'm not sure if you recognize that might have had that effect on me. And so I wanted to talk to you about it. Now, sure, for instance, if this is a gendered bias, if you're a woman and having this conversation with a man, he may think that you're being emotional for bringing this to their attention. But you have to give people an opportunity to think and to recalibrate, because they might, as we already have discussed, they might not be aware that this is something that's operating in them and that this is the effect that it's having on you. And so that really is what I think step one is to be able to have the courage to speak out about these things when you're experiencing them, even when a client is involved as well. But you know, when that's happening, I would suggest you to Charlotte's point, get some support, especially from partners perhaps, who might have also recognized that this is going on, because they're far more empowered within your organization to address it than you might be.
Yeah. And even if you address it once and you feel like the reaction the other one is giving you is not the reaction you hoped for or you expected, that is probably because of the other person, because of the other person's personality, or he is shocked, or she, that can also be possible, and kind of ashamed. So I believe in the power of repeating and keep addressing those things in different ways, as Renaud said. And it's probably best not to be too aggressive at first, because then people are like, oh, we have this again. But to do it in a kind of positive way, not, however, lowering your message, but to repeat and to try it in different ways.
Thank you for that. I have another question here. So I very much recognize from my own experience what you mean with the likability bias. I also have made the experience that I'm biased in a positive way when I meet people who have character traits that I would like to have. Is that officially qualified as a bias?
Charlotte, I can leave that to you, but I think that's good. Yeah, go ahead.
I think our answer already showed. Yes, it's definitely a bias. As I said in the beginning, we are really talking about biases in a kind of negative way, but they work both ways. So yes, that's also a bias, but a positive one. So you like people sooner, but also again negative, because that implies that people that don't have that characteristics, or the characteristics you would like to have, are probably more negative in your eyes. So yeah.
So for an example about that, you know, I might have a bias or a preference for, or an assumption that a certain group of people, for instance, that they're good at math, and so because of that, I might go to that person. Or if I'm in a situation where I am privileged to delegate work to people, I might choose a person who is a member of that class or that group to do this math-related work, not knowing whether or not that person actually has the competency, whether that person actually is good at math. I just assume that, oh, they're part of that group of people, so they should be able to do this work. And so I give them the work based on my assumptions that this person is, as a member of that class, good at math. And that happens all of the time. It's a positive thing. One, you know, I wish I was good at math, but you know, these things come into play in so many very different ways, in the ways that we interact with people in the workplace and in our private lives as well.
Thank you. I have another question here. It says, can you please cite some examples where women leadership successfully tried to remove the bias against women in her organization? And please also suggest overall measures that can be adopted. Please throw some light on legislative measures by governments regarding maternity aspect in favor of women, and successful enforcement by organizations. Thanks.
So Charlotte, yeah, go ahead.
I think the last part about the legislative aspects, I think it's a really good question, since we're all lawyers, and actually a lot of legislators are taking measures. maybe not only the maternal aspect, but more broad. What are legislators doing about the inequality? And also part of the reason is implicit gender bias. In my study, I saw that a lot of countries and a lot of legislators are introducing a quota, a binding quota. For example, in France, they have a quota of 40% for certain companies, and that implies that there has to be a 40% diversity, so 40% male, 40% female. And if they do not comply with that, the sanction is suspension of payment of director fees, which often is a good sanction because it's they're affected as an individual, and also vacant director positions, so that the person that is that got the job is not actually having the job because it's not compliant with legislation. And in the Netherlands, we are now discussing a bill which says, a limited quotum for the supervisory board of listed companies, and a quotum is 30%. And so only the supervisory board. Apparently, we are not very ambitious on this topic, unfortunately. And second, ambitious and appropriate targets for large companies. So the companies are addressing their own, their individual responsibility. And with maternity, you see a lot of legislation about getting back to work, but also splitting the maternity leave between male and female, mother and father, and how all the combinations that can exist, and splitting it. And if you split it between the partners, then you get extra leave. So you could, I think in Scandinavia, they have a system like this, and that makes that also the other partner who does not give birth can stay at home as well. So the unequal chances you get at work are kind of more equalized because you both stay at home, or you both have the opportunity to stay at home. But it's really brief because we don't have a lot of time.
And so just really quickly, in addition to legislative things that have been put in place across countries, something else that individual organizations can do is join organizations. That when you're in a legislative framework where you either cannot or nations have not made choices to legislate change in this way, there are organizations like, for instance, the 30% Club that organizations have joined. Law firms and companies alike are joining and creating organizations like this, where there are coalitions to highlight the fact that there is a gender imbalance in leadership within organizations, and that they decide on their own accord that they're going to make sure that there is a certain percentage, i.e. 30%, women in leadership, for instance, within that organization. There are other things that that law firms and companies can do to make sure that that there's gender balance and equity within their organization. But you know, I think that we've touched on some of that. But now that we're at the end of the hour, I want to make sure that we're also respectful of time. Maybe we can be invited back for a part 2 and talk about that as well.
Perfect.
Yes, I was about to say we are getting to the end now. First, I want to say thanks a lot to both of you, Charlotte and RENAULD, and Katja, of course, and Jennifer and Paola, and the AIJA staff who has been helping us. We've got lots of more questions, but unfortunately, we're getting to the end. So anyone who would like to follow up with our speakers with the additional questions, please do so. AIJA has just shared, I can see here, all our contacts, so feel free to contact us or follow up directly with Charlotte and RENAULD. Katja, would you like to add anything?
I just wanted to say thank you, and thanks for everyone that attended today and asked questions. We really enjoyed our session today.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
everyone.